Scott is here to talk to us tonight about debunking myths. Without further ado, give a round of applause for Scott.
So I'm going to get my notes out here because we got a lot of good information here. So let me start off by saying that the Bush administration knew of impending attacks, and the collapse of the buildings was the result of a controlled demolition in order to justify the Iraqi invasion. There's a hominid-like creature, possibly a sole surviving representative of Gigantopithecus, that inhabits the Pacific Northwest of the United States. CO2 is not actually rising. And even if it is, it has no impact on climate warming. And even if there is warming, it's due to natural causes. And even if it can't be explained by natural causes, human influence is insignificant. Plus, it's just a theory. They're not crop circles, they're saucer nests. Saucer nests, yes, they are. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity causes headaches, fatigue, stress, sleep disturbances, skin symptoms like prickling, burning, and rashes, pain and ache in the muscles, and many other health problems. And by the way, cell phones cause cancer. Saddam Hussein had extensive programs pursuing chemical, nuclear, and biological weapons of mass destruction, as evidenced by the existence of anthrax, mobile bioproduction facilities, and yellow cake uranium. We never actually landed on the moon. These were faked and staged by NASA and shot on a soundstage, as evidenced by the waving flag, the lack of stars in photos, the inconsistent angles of shadows, and the fact that it would have been impossible for a human to have survived the radiation exposure. In 1998, a study by Andrew Wakefield demonstrated conclusively that the MMR vaccine causes autism. Now, what I've shown you are just a few examples of the numerous examples of myths and conspiracy theories founded on myths that are all supported by misinformation. And of course, the solution to this is to provide people with more and more facts, right? That's how we solve the problem of myths and misinformation. However, that's not exactly true. Public misperceptions are not necessarily due to a lack of knowledge, according to the information deficit theory. Packing more information to a person's head doesn't solve the issue, okay? They don't process information that simply. Misinformation is incorrect information, regardless of how or why a person acquired that information. And refuting it requires an understanding of the complex cognitive processes related to how one processes information, how one modifies their existing knowledge, and how one's worldview affects their ability to process new information. It's not just what people think that matters, it's how people think. So I'm going to talk about the continued influence effects that was demonstrated by Johnson and Seifert in 1994 study, and I'm going to refer to my notes here because I've read like 20 of these studies, and I get confused about which one did which and what the numbers were. So I'm going to refer to my notes here. I'm not going to go over all the studies, though, so just relax. This one was about the warehouse fire, yes. So subjects were in 3 control groups were given a series of reports describing an investigation of a warehouse fire that was started by a short circuit in a closet. Group 1 was the control group, and they were told that the closet was empty. Group 2 was told that the closet contained cans of oil paint and pressurized gas. And then the statement immediately after that, they said, no, wait, the closet was empty. Group number 3 was told of the cans of oil paint and the pressurized gas in the closet. And only several minutes later, after processing several more statements, were they told, no, wait, the closet was empty. What they found was that 90% of the participants who got the corrected information recalled that they got the corrected information, but also 30% of those still included that misinformation in their responses to questions after the fact, like questions like, how did the fire start? Well, it started from a short circuit. What do you think caused so much smoke? Well, it could have been the oil pan, or the oil paint. Wait a minute, that wasn't really in there, and you recalled that it wasn't in there. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. So that demonstrates that even when we get information, even when it's corrected, it still has a lingering effect on our cognitive processes. And efforts to debunk can be inadvertently reinforced by the myth if we're not careful about how we do it. And I'm going to show you the different backfire effects that can occur if we're not careful about how we do it. These backfire effects include familiarity, overkill, and worldview. So let's go through each of these in one slide each. The familiarity backfire effect says that familiarity with a claim increases one's propensity to accept that claim as true. This particularly affects this effect is particularly strong in people that don't have a good memory, like myself. Skernick et al. In 2005 demonstrated this with a study in which they provided participants with one set of participants with a flyer that said flu vaccines, facts and myths, and another group that had flu vaccine facts. And what they found was they, after 30 minutes, after reviewing these sheets, in fact, let me give you an example. One of the statements was that people can die from the flu. True. And that was stated on the flyer. Another statement was the side effects of the flu vaccine are worse than the flu. False. And they included several statements like that indicating whether it was true or false. And after reading those and having a chance to process them, 4% of people immediately after reading that were misclassifying some of the mythical statements as true statements. But 30 minutes later, 15% of those mythical statements were identified as fact. So later in the process, when the memory of what they just seen began to fade, the lingering effects of the misinformation crept in, and the fact that they were familiar with those statements, they recalled them as true. What's interesting about that is that while the mythical statements were remembered as true, the factual statements were very rarely remembered as false. Familiarity breeds understanding that the fact is true. So, but in order to debunk a myth, you have to mention it, right? You have to talk about it. How do we get around that? Well, the way we get around that is by focusing on the facts. You emphasize the core facts, and you stay away from the myth, only to mention it briefly, but continue to hit on the facts and stay hard on the facts. So that's one backfire effect. The next backfire effect is the overkill backfire effect. Now, the common wisdom is, as I mentioned earlier, that the more arguments you provide, the more successful you'll be in countermanding the myth, and we all know that doesn't work. The overkill backfire effects occurs because processing many arguments takes more effort than processing just a few. Additionally, processing more complex arguments takes a lot more effort than processing very simple arguments. So we want to make sure that we provide a few arguments that are very simple and easy to process. Schwartz et al. In 2007 demonstrated this with a published, I think they did. Where is that? That's Schwartz. Oh my goodness, what did I do with Schwartz? Oh, there's Schwartz. They demonstrated this with something called processing fluency. And I'm not going to go into all the details because there's a lot of numbers and a lot of statistics thrown around about how they get to where they're going. But I'll give you a flavor. They tested processing fluency, which refers to the ease or difficulty with which new external information can be processed. It's broken down into two parts. There's perceptual fluency, which refers to the ease or difficulty with which you can perceive the information. Is it clear? Is it focused? Can I see it? Is it contrasted? Are there colors where I can perceive it? Can I hear what the speaker's saying? Just how do I perceive the new information? And the next one is conceptual fluency, which represents the speed and accuracy with which I understand and identify the meaning of what I'm seeing and hearing. What they found was that people assume that material that is familiar They assume that material that is familiar is easier to process than unfamiliar material. They erroneously infer that they have seen material before when it's easy to process. Remember the familiarity effect? When they've seen it before, they're more likely to remember it as true. This fluency-familiarity link fosters the acceptance of new information as true when it's easy to process, but flags it when it's difficult to process. Information that's more fluently processed is evaluated more favorably. So if it's easy to process, if they understand it clearly, it foments a sense of familiarity with it, and therefore, I think it's true. How do we deal with that? Well, when we rebut the myth, when we try to correct the misinformation, we want to make those rebuttals and those counterarguments as easy to process as possible. Make them succinct, make them easy, use graphics, whatever it takes to make sure that the information can be processed. In fact, end with a strong message and that's tweetable. That's a good reference. If it's short enough and succinct enough to be tweetable, it's probably something that can be remembered. Finally, we have the worldview effect. Nobody has ever dealt with this one, I'm sure. Several cognitive processes go into the worldview effect. Now, this is people process information through the filter of their already held beliefs. And that can lead to confirmation bias, which is selectively seeking out information that supports and reinforces their own worldview. Disconfirmation bias, which I'd never heard of before, but it says it's spending significantly more time and thought arguing against an opponent's arguments. And then attitude bolstering, which is the combination of the two, I presume, which is bringing supporting facts to mind and ignoring the controverting facts. Tabor and Lodge did a study in 2006, which they presented. Which one was this? Yes. They exposed participants to attitudes they measured participants' attitudes with regard to affirmative action and gun control. They measured them through a series of batteries of tests, and then when they were done, they exposed those participants to a balanced set of pro-con information on affirmative action and gun control with cited sources. So there would be a statement, and the statement was from the NRA, or another statement that was from Citizens Against Handguns. And even before they read the statement, they had an opinion about it just based on the source. That's good information to realize. People were often unable to escape the pull of their prior attitudes. That's powerful. So, in particular, some people have their own self-image and their own self-worth wrapped up into these ideologies, and those are the most difficult to deal with. So, how do we get around that? How do we deal with that? Well, I'm going to roll my eyes a little bit at this one. Self-affirmation and framing. The framing I understand. Using language that's less threatening. Using a carbon offset instead of saying a tax. Saying death tax instead of inheritance tax to try to turn people away from it. Self-affirmation. I don't know. You got to let them know that they're worthy or they're worth it or whatever. Maybe you have to say you're pretty and you're smart before you tell them they're wrong. I don't know. Maybe that's what that means. It sounds like a little bit of manipulation to me, but they say it works, and so I'm going with it. So we've talked about 3 backfire effects. We've talked about the familiarity backfire effect, the overkill, and the worldview. Let's presume that we've been able, through these 3 different methods, to disabuse someone of some misinformation. Then what do? Well, now we have to fill the gap, because when people take in information, they build mental models about that information. They build a framework that takes in that information and puts it into a context and supported by the myth or the misinformation. So when the myth information is debunked, that leaves a gap. There's a hole in there. And that's uncomfortable for them. People do not like ignorance. They don't like when they don't know. And we all know this. We've all encountered this. The problem is that people prefer an incorrect model over an incomplete model. In the absence of a better explanation, they'll opt for the wrong explanation. This is troubling, but we've all seen it. In fact, we've all probably fallen victim to it. Ecker et al. In 2011 published a study in which they showed this effect. This is the minibus incident. So they showed, this is the last one, by the way, so just relax. They showed participants a series of statements regarding a fictitious minibus accident, in which they included a statement of misinformation that said, police stated the passengers were a group of elderly people returning from the nursing home. Then they provided several groups with one group that received no correction to that misinformation. They had another group that received a simple retraction of the form, police stated the passengers on the bus were not elderly. Okay? And then a third group received a later retraction, but with an alternative, which stated something on the order of, police stated the passengers on the minibus were not elderly, but rather college hockey players returning from a victory party. What they found when quizzing the participants after the fact, that those who received just the simple retraction still had a 20% error rate in including misinformation in their responses to questioning, whereas those who received an alternative had only 11% error rate. So that demonstrated that having the alternative in there did provide some relief from this continued influence effect. So what does this mean? This means we have to fill the gap, and how do we do that? We provide an explanation as to why the myth is wrong. We expose them to the rhetorical techniques that are used to proffer misinformation, such as fake experts, cherry picking, logical fallacies, and the like. And we explain why the misinformer may have promoted the myth. So these are the techniques for filling the gap and making sure we don't leave them with something they have to fill themselves, because they're going to fill it with misinformation. So now that we've identified the backfire effects, we've looked at the filling the gap, let's talk about the anatomy of an effective debunking argument. That argument, first and foremost, must concentrate on the core facts. Emphasize the core facts, but present only the key facts, and use graphics and illustrations if possible. Whoa, that is a nasty looking. The familiarity effect and the overkill effect are opposed by using these methods. And of course, once again, in order to oppose the worldview effect, you're pretty, you're smart, but you're wrong. Explicit warnings to let them know that what you're about to tell them is a myth. It's misinformation. Then you tell them the misinformation, and then you provide an alternative explanation. Tell them why that's wrong. So let's go through an example. So this is an example that was provided that shows the anatomy of a good debunking. First and foremost, and I know you can't read all this, but that's okay. I'm going to read it to you. It's very short. First and foremost, you start out with the key fact in the headline. 97 out of 100 climate experts agree that humans cause global warming. Then you follow that up with a strong core statement that reinforces that core fact, which says several independent surveys find 97% of climate scientists who are actively publishing peer-reviewed climate research agree that humans are causing global warming. So now we've got our core fact, we've got a good opening headline. We illustrate that with our core fact with a graphic here. Here you see a silhouette of 100, climate scientists. 97 of them are green, indicating that they agree that humans are causing this. 3 of them down here are not green. I guess 2 of them are gray because they can't make up their mind, and 1 says, no, that can't be the case. So now we have a core fact that's illustrated by a nice graphic. So now that we have all this, we provide the explicit warning, hey, misinformation is about to head your way. However, movements that deny a scientific consensus have always sought to cast doubt on the fact that a consensus exists. One technique is the use of fake experts, citing scientists who have little to no expertise in the field of science. We've provided them the warning, now provide them the myth. For example, the OISM Petition Project claims that 31,000 scientists disagree with the scientific consensus on global warming. We got the myth there, now fill the gap. However, around 99.9% of the scientists listed in the Petition Project are not climate scientists. The petition is open to anyone with a Bachelor of Science or higher and includes medical doctors, mechanical engineers, and computer scientists. So there you have it, the core fact, a supporting argument with that core fact, a nice graphic, explicit warning, there's the myth, and you fill the gap. A beautiful debunking, right? Nobody's going to believe global warming is not a myth anymore. Or, did I say that right? Wow. All right. I've convinced myself. Sir? Oh, you can include anything you want. This was just an example. I mean, there are numerous examples. So this is just a summary of everything that we've talked about thus far. It includes the continued influence effect about the need to fill the gap with an alternative explanation, the familiarity backfire effect that it says repeating the myth can reinforce it, so you have to emphasize the facts, the overkill backfire effect, which means it needs to be simple and easy to understand so they'll accept it, and the worldview backfire effect, which means you have to tell them they're pretty, they're smart, but they're wrong. I'm going to end this presentation with a quote from JFK, which I think is a cogent and salient quote for this. He said, "The enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." And so with that, I will end and encourage you to take a look at the Debunking Handbook by John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski. Thank you.
All right. Q&A period, or are you just Q&A?
Oh, if they want.
Absolutely. It looks like we have a hot one right here.
Trial lawyers used consultants to train them on exactly what you've been talking about, how to get a certain point across to a jury. And what you've pointed out to us explains a lot of really bad jury decisions.
I will note that I watch a lot of law TV, so I'm very expert when it comes to the law. And I do note that very often the lawyers will make a statement they know will be objected to and overruled because it gets it into the jury's mind, and that continued influence effect therefore affects their ability to, process that information.
Hi. One of the things I've heard is that people often skim over negatives in a sentence. So like if I said, "I am not a bank robber," they'll hear, "I'm a bank robber." Do you have any studies that have explored that concept?
No, they didn't really go into the semantics of, the construction of the statements. What they talked about, at least in the studies that I read, was just providing the statement and then providing the misinformation and then providing a retraction of that misinformation. They didn't talk about the construction to the sense or anything. But what you say, I don't know, that may be the case, I don't know.
First Warner, we'll come up here next.
Well, going along with your idea of complimenting the person, I've heard of this approach called the sandwich approach, whereby you first compliment the person or agree with them, and then you tell them your your reason for what you don't like, and then you compliment them again. Like if someone didn't do a good job washing the dishes, you tell them, "Oh, thanks for washing the dishes. But next time you got to wash the rim because it was a little greasy, but you did a good job. Thanks for doing it." So maybe that would help in this kind of a case too.
Right, and it smacks of the same kind of affirming, self-affirming approach that they talk about. When I read that, I felt that it was manipulative, but that's just me. They seem to think it works, and they're the experts. I just work here, so.
My question is, because I'm a curious viewer of politics in America, when somebody picks on someone, and I'm going to use this example that they're using about the emails of Hillary Clinton, do not know whether she's telling a lie or not, but the fact that they keep saying it over year after year after year, I wonder if that all this stuff plays into politics on a daily basis.
I've heard, and you bring up a good point, I've heard someone say that it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, just keep saying it. Keep saying it, keep saying it, keep saying it, keep saying it. And, you know, the familiarity effect, you know, people hear it again and again and again, and they remember it as true. One thing I forgot to mention here with the overkill effect was that there's a Republican strategist by the name of Dr. Frank Luntz. Everybody ever heard of Luntz? He wrote a book called Words That Work. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. He talks about the use of language and using, instead of saying a carbon offset and a tax or whatever, he's brilliant at framing the discussion so that he gets you to emotionally buy in to what he wants you to understand ideologically. So that's an important thing to remember too. It's so hard to not be manipulated by the rhetoric that's out there today.
All right. Any other questions? Anyone?
All right. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.